missiles were already in the air.
Not warnings, not threats, strikes. Before most of the world understood what was happening, a message appeared. The United States had begun combat operations inside Iran. Within hours, nuclear facilities were hit. Senior leadership was reportedly killed. A government that had ruled since 1979 was suddenly vulnerable. But the real shock was not the explosions. It was the implication. It was legal. Because if a country can strike first, without authorization from the United Nations, while negotiations are still underway, while diplomacy is still active, what does that mean for the rules that govern everyone else? This is not simply a regional escalation. It is a stress test of sovereignty, of international law, of the post-World War II order. And the consequences may not be measured in territory. They may be measured in precedent. If you value calm, evidence-based documentary analysis, like, share, subscribe, and join the discussion below. Let's begin. To understand why the legality question matters, you have to understand the ground beneath it. This confrontation did not begin in February 2026. It accumulated. For more than 4 decades, Washington and Tehran have operated in a state of managed hostility. Sanctions, proxy conflicts, cyber operations, covert strikes. Iran funded and armed regional militias. The United States strengthened Iran's regional adversaries. Iran expanded its nuclear enrichment. The US escalated economic pressure. In 2015, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, temporarily constrained Iran's enrichment in exchange for sanctions relief. In 2018, the United States withdrew. By 2025, the International Atomic Energy Agency reported that Iran had enriched uranium up to 60% purity. That level is below weapons grade, but significantly closer to it. The IAEA also stated it had no verified evidence that Iran was actively building a nuclear weapon. US intelligence assessments publicly echoed that conclusion. So the situation sat in ambiguity: advanced capability, uncertain intent. Diplomatic talks were ongoing. Oman had mediated indirect discussions. A third round had recently concluded. Technical meetings were scheduled in Vienna. Then, the strikes began. At an emergency session of the United Nations Security Council, Secretary General Antonio Guterres said the military action had, quote, squandered an opportunity for diplomacy. Whether that opportunity would have succeeded is unknowable, but it ended that morning. This moment was not one decision, it was a sequence. In 2024, Iran and Israel exchanged direct strikes for the first time. Hundreds of drones, hundreds of missiles, a threshold crossed. In October of that year, Israeli forces struck Iranian air defense systems and missile production facilities. Israeli officials described it as their largest direct operation inside Iran to date. Iran's allied groups, including Hamas, Hezbollah, and Houthi forces, suffered major operational losses during the broader regional escalation. Analysts describe the so-called axis of resistance as weakened, but not dismantled. In June 2025, US and Israeli forces conducted coordinated strikes against Iranian nuclear facilities. The campaign lasted 12 days. Iran retaliated regionally. A US-brokered ceasefire followed. It held. Temporarily. In January 2026, large-scale protests erupted inside Iran. Human rights organizations reported thousands killed during the crackdown. Iranian authorities disputed those figures. President Donald Trump issued a public warning, Help is on the way. Through January and February, the United States increased troop deployments and naval positioning in the region. Defense analysts described it as the largest U.S. buildup in the Middle East since 2003. Nuclear talks resumed in Geneva. Progress was reported. Then, talks stalled. U.S. negotiators demanded zero enrichment. Iran rejected the condition. On February 28, 2026, U.S. officials announced the beginning of a military operation later referred to as Operation Epic Fury. Strikes were reported across multiple Iranian cities. Iranian state media confirmed that Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei had been killed. Independent verification of all strike targets and casualties remained ongoing in the immediate aftermath. Iran responded within hours. Ballistic missiles toward Israel, drone and missile strikes targeting U.S. military installations across the Gulf region. Regional governments confirmed impacts in multiple countries. Iranian officials declared the Strait of Hormuz closed. Maritime tracking data later showed severe shipping disruption, though enforcement of the closure remained contested. Open hostilities were no longer theoretical, and the world was watching. The United Nations Security Council convened the same day. China and Russia requested the emergency session. Russia's ambassador described the strikes as, quote, a premeditated act of armed aggression. China's foreign ministry stated the action trampled on the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. Beijing called for an immediate ceasefire. Chinese authorities began evacuating citizens from Iran. Pakistan's foreign ministry condemned what it called unwarranted attacks. Brazil and Mexico called for restraint. Colombia issued direct condemnation. Across much of the global south, the framing centered on sovereignty and Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, the prohibition on the use of force against the territorial integrity of a state. Secretary General Guterres reiterated that principle in the chamber. He condemned both the initial strikes and Iran's retaliatory attacks on neighboring countries. But the legal emphasis was clear. Several European leaders echoed similar concerns. Norway's foreign minister stated that preventative strikes require an immediately imminent threat. Spain's prime minister criticized unilateral military action. These were not isolated comments. They reflected a broader legal anxiety, not about Iran's politics, but about precedent. For many countries, particularly outside Western alliances, the language sounded familiar. Prevent a regime from acquiring weapons of mass destruction. In 2003, that justification was used in Iraq. No stockpiles were found. In 2011, NATO air operations in Libya contributed to the fall of Muammar Gaddafi. Libya remains politically fragmented. These historical parallels resurfaced quickly in global commentary. The Arab Center in Washington argued that regime change, as a stated objective, has no clear basis in international law. The Stimson Center noted that diplomatic demands for zero enrichment without sanctions relief created structural barriers to agreement. Brookings Institution scholars warn that regime collapse could produce instability exceeding prior interventions. These assessments reflect ongoing debate, but they also reflect memory and credibility. Foreign policy is rarely judged in isolation. It is judged against history. Iran became a full member of BRICS in 2024. The bloc includes Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Its expansion was widely interpreted as a signal of a shifting global order. But when strikes hit Iran, the bloc did not issue a unified response. Individual members reacted differently. India condemned Iranian strikes on Gulf states. The United Arab Emirates, also aligned with BRICS expansion frameworks, condemned Iranian retaliation after impacts were reported on its territory. Russia issued strong verbal condemnation of the US and Israeli operation. But beyond diplomatic language, Moscow's options appeared limited. Analysts noted that multipolar ambition does not automatically translate into coordinated power. The Global South may question American dominance, but its alternative institutions remain fragmented. International law was being debated loudly. Its enforcement mechanisms remained uncertain. The consequences moved quickly into markets. The Strait of Hormuz carries roughly 1/5 of globally traded oil. Energy prices spiked within hours of disruption announcements. The Columbia Center on Global Energy Policy assessed that liquefied natural gas infrastructure in the Gulf could face longer-term vulnerability than oil flows alone. Air traffic across major Gulf hubs was disrupted. Regional authorities confirmed airport closures and flight cancellations. Shipping insurers reassessed risk exposure in the region. Supply chain analysts warned that extended instability could affect food imports across Gulf states within weeks. This conflict may have begun in Tehran, but its economic reach extended to Lagos, Jakarta, Sao Paulo, Mumbai. Globalization ensures that regional wars do not remain regional. At the Security Council, the United States invoked Article 51 of the UN Charter, the right of self-defense. U.S. officials cited Iran's nuclear advancements and prior regional attacks. Legal scholars questioned the applicability. Under prevailing interpretations, self-defense requires an armed attack or an imminent threat leaving no alternative remedy. There had been no publicly confirmed Iranian attack on U.S. territory in the immediate days preceding the operation. Negotiations had been underway. Legal analysts at Just Security described the strikes as inconsistent with the Charter framework. The European Council on Foreign Relations used the phrase "war of choice." Supporters of the operation argued that long-term threat trajectories matter, that waiting for an attack may not be strategically rational, that anticipatory self-defense remains legally contested but not universally rejected. International legal scholars remain divided. What is not disputed, the Security Council did not authorize the strikes. No resolution was passed. Inside Iran, reactions were mixed. State media broadcast mourning. Diaspora communities in Europe and North America showed varied responses. Internet disruptions were reported within hours of the strikes. Protests occurred in multiple cities globally. Civilian harm was documented. Local officials reported casualties at civilian facilities. International media outlets verified selected incidents through satellite imagery and hospital confirmations. Exact casualty figures varied across sources in the early reporting period. The International Committee of the Red Cross warned of escalating humanitarian risk. War at scale redistributes suffering toward those with the least influence over policy. That pattern holds across regions, across decades. Iran's government did not immediately collapse. Council on Foreign Relations analysts noted the Islamic Republic's layered institutional structure. A transitional council was reportedly formed, but no uncontested successor emerged. The nuclear issue remained unresolved. IAEA inspection access had been limited since earlier strikes in 2025. Some enriched uranium was believed to remain stored in hardened facilities. Military force can degrade infrastructure. Whether it can permanently eliminate knowledge is another matter. Does bombing a nuclear-capable state deter proliferation or accelerate it? What precedent does this establish for other regional powers? If diplomatic negotiations can be overtaken by unilateral force, what message does that send? These questions are being debated in capitals across multiple continents. they will not be resolved quickly. This confrontation did not begin overnight. It accumulated, policy decision by policy decision. Sanctions, withdrawal from agreements, escalation cycles. And when the strikes occurred, the dominant global reaction was not uniform support. It was legal concern. Not because Iran lacked critics, but because the method challenged established norms. The Secretary General stated, "There is no viable alternative to the peaceful settlement of international disputes." Whether that principle retains force remains to be seen. What is certain, the world is observing, carefully. And the consequences of this precedent may extend far beyond this region. Containment becomes an aspiration, not an assurance. Hungry for more documentaries like this? Like, share, subscribe, and check out our other videos on Crime Chronicles. Tell us what you think in the comments.